All right, well, though some of you may be aficionados of SpongeBob SquarePants, I don't know very much about him, except that I watched one time, I don't know, I had the dentist's office or somewhere, and I saw this little guy right here called Plankton. And he was an ornery little rascal. All he did was cause trouble. And this is little stories about little things that live in the ocean, and the bad guy was Plankton. And that's the kind of the image that a lot of us have grown up with algae, is that they're a nuisance. Well, and then to just contrast that with a book that just came out last year, won an award, children's book, called The Incredible True Story of Tiny Mighty Al. You can get it on Amazon if you happen to be interested. But it presents little tiny algae as heroes. And so the image is very much changing. You all know, for example, about problems that you read in the newspaper about foul lakes, toxic red tides. These are algae that can actually poison fish. And more specifically, the problem during the Beijing Olympics, which messed up, or potentially messed up, the sailing events because of the horrible algae that fouled the bay adjacent to there. And so these are the images that we have. But nowadays, if you go to the web, what you see is things like this. Futuristic pictures of algae growing in imaginative ways, pumping them into your gas tank, untold acres of algae. Well, these are so far actually imaginary. This isn't what actually is happening today, but this is the kind of vision we got today. So algae is very, very differently perceived today than it was just 5 or 10 years ago. Now, here's some examples of some of the excitement. There are two organizations in the U.S. called the ABO and the NAA that are devoted solely to algae. These are trade organizations that have hundreds and hundreds of members. There's a magazine. This happens to be an electronic magazine, but it comes out every day, just having to do with commercialization of algae. The Department of Energy has put hundreds of millions of dollars into algae research to try to commercialize it, perhaps for fuel, for example. This is the biggest, I'm associated with this group, the NAABB, which is one large organization doing this. Every major oil company has an investment in algae right now. ExxonMobil has committed $600 million, for example, as some of you know. There are companies, this is one of the more prominent ones, I think, who have spent hundreds of millions of dollars investing in algae, gradually learning how to scale up, how to take products out of it, and how to use them. There are a few laboratories in the U.S., major laboratories for pilot-scale growth, and I know it's going to be hard for some of you to see at the bottom. Sorry about that. Arizona State University is leading that effort. And then there are whole cities that have made major commitments, tens of millions of dollars to algae research. San Diego, notably, especially, has spent a lot of money, has a consortium of all the universities in the city of San Diego actually working on this problem. So this gives you an idea of how broad this is in the United States and also around the world. It's not a trivial endeavor. Last week, I just came back from what was called a summit, a meeting of primarily industrial people, technologists, some engineers, some scientists, and some business people who are interested in commercializing algae and are actually beginning to do things that looks like they may be able to commercialize within a very short period of time. This happens to be a picture from 2010. I didn't have access to the one from last week. But there were 800 people there. And I admit I do not go to rock concerts, but I've seen pictures from there. But if you can imagine the corresponding kind of response you get from middle-aged men and women, it's kind of what I saw at this meeting. A lot of enthusiasm. And obviously, this is something that has caught the eye of a lot of people. All right. So why all this excitement about algae? Why so much excitement? Well, what I want to do today is talk a little bit about that excitement. I want to talk about where we've been, and I'm going to talk about some ancient history for a few minutes, and then I'm going to talk about where we are now. What's the status right now of algae? And then finally, I'm going to do some speculation about where I think we're going to be or likely to be in the future. So we're going to start with a little speculation and end with a little speculation, and in the middle we're going to talk about what's actually happening right now, including things that are happening at the University of Texas right now. So if we start at the beginning, I guess we could start way back at the beginning of the solar system. I'm sorry about these things at the bottom, but this indicates the different eras of the Earth, starting way back when the Earth was formed with the rest of the solar system about 4.6 billion years ago. There wasn't any life then. So life actually began about 3.8 billion years ago. The Earth was already about a quarter of its current age. And during that time, and this is where the speculation is, it's believed that life formed by little bubble-like things that were able to take energy-rich molecules, organic molecules, if you will, that were there naturally because of the heating of the Earth, and sort of gobble them up and use the energy from those and make a living so they could eventually learn how to divide and make more little cells. And so that seemed to have worked for a long time. And it's mostly models that indicate this. It isn't really proven. But if this did happen, which there is good circumstantial evidence for, then they eventually started to use up all those organic molecules, all those energy-rich molecules. And so life on Earth would have, in that case, a very limited existence. But what came to the rescue then was these little guys. And there's a few of these still around in Australia and a few places even now in the world. And we find fossils of these things going back about 2.5 billion years ago, a long time ago. And these guys were called stromatolites. These actually had little algae inside. These little algae could capture sunlight, convert it into organic molecules, and the Earth was still pretty hostile then, so not many things lived out here. But right in here were little communities of not only these little algae called cyanobacteria, but there were other kinds of bacteria. Some of these little bubble-like things that started life on Earth probably lived in here and made a living from these microalgae, these tiny algae, which then could capture sun energy and ultimately recycle these carbon-containing molecules back into a form that other organisms could use. So we had something operating even way back then in a small scale, kind of like what happens today. Now, that had a lot of significance for the Earth, and this is just one illustration. There wasn't very much oxygen at all in the atmosphere until these little guys came along that could do photosynthesis, and one of the products that they produce is oxygen gas. And so there is very good evidence now, looking at isotopes and rocks and so forth, that the oxygen levels started coming up very rapidly way back a short time after these stromatolites, after these little structures containing microalgae started forming. And then when more advanced kinds of algae showed up here still a very long time ago, about a billion years ago, then it went up to present day levels. And so really the oxygen content of the world today really was originally developed because of algae. Same is true of the organic compounds of the world today. And also carbon dioxide levels originally were low because of algae, microalgae especially, capturing that, assimilating it into carbon-containing molecules and carrying it away from the atmosphere. So these things, this debris accumulated, and the pictures we see oftentimes in the encyclopedias and so forth are the idea that as life became more developed, we had all these extensive plants, as shown right here. And as these died, they left debris on the ground. All kinds of natural processes buried them, earthquakes and so forth buried them, and that's where our petroleum supplies today came. What most people don't realize is a large part of those petroleum and other fossil fuels today actually came even before plants existed on Earth, and certainly in parallel with plants, through algae. These guys would primarily, they lived in bodies of water, and they would accumulate, sink to the bottom, and accumulate as organic matter that ultimately became deposits of oil, also gas, and coal supplies. And so that's what we're really mining today, is in large part algae that were buried many millions of years ago. So that's what we illustrate right here, is that the water right here, this is an example of an alga, this little complicated name here, Botryococcus, is an alga that produces lots and lots of oil. Unfortunately, nobody knows how to grow it fast and still get it to produce oil. A lot of research being done on this one because it seems to be one of the ones that produced oil many, many millions of years ago, because if we look at the content of that, some of the best petroleum now, the organic content has some unique signatures that suggest it came from this very specialized kind of alga here. All right, so we use not only petroleum from algae, much of it which came from algae, but limestone came from an alga. This is one that grows in huge amounts in the oceans. It settles, it forms limestone, which of course is used to build the University of Tower and many other university buildings. Another thing is a lot of algae, a certain kind of algae, make glass shells. And these glass shells are actually occur in huge amounts in the oceans now. These accumulate as diatomaceous earth. These guys are called diatoms. And this diatomaceous earth now is mined for all sorts of commercial products, everything from dog flea powder to swimming pool filtering material. Very, very diverse products. Well, algae is an important commercial product even today. Most people don't really realize that algae is a multi-hundred billion dollar industry and was so even before the current fad really caught on. And this is some examples of where algae have actually been used, especially in the Far East, but also in Europe and in the US more and more. And these are big algae. These are algae big enough you can hold them in your hand. Some of them grow up to be several hundred feet tall. Most of them are called red algae or brown algae. Here's a couple of kinds of red ones. Here's a brown one that are used for nori, which is used to wrap sushi, for example, and many other really beautifully presented and good tasting products, especially in Japan. This carrageenan is a kind of molecule that's extracted from another red alga that's used in all sorts of things, especially as a thickener in things like Miracle Whip, ice cream here, all sorts of things, cosmetics. And then some of these brown algae, for example, also have gelatinous-like material. These are all kind of gelatinous. These here are kind of gelatinous that are used for things like dental impressions, the capsule that surrounds the medicines that one might take as in a capsule form, lots of things like that. So these are big industries today. Now, what about microalgae? We distinguish macroalgae from microalgae very kind of artificially. Macroalgae are the big ones we have big enough we can hold them in our hand, or so big sometimes we can't even carry them. The microalgae ones are the microscopic ones that are so tiny we have to use a microscope to see, many of them a single cell. Well, microalgae is a different story. Microalgae really haven't been used that much commercially in the past, but there are some notable exceptions. There's a little microalgae called spirulina that if you go to any health food store, you'll find it on the shelf. It contains about 70% protein. It's advertised to have a wonderful amino acid balance and vitamins and so forth. I have no idea how good those claims are, but I assume they must be pretty good because lots of people buy it. And it's been farmed in West Central Africa for many years from natural sources. It has to be kind of a eutrophied or kind of a dirty source. It has to have lots of organic matter and be high temperature, being very alkaline. But it's just been harvested naturally. And it's been harvested in central Mexico, for example, for the last 5 decades or so. And it's sold. I was in Thailand a couple of years ago to a farm that was farming this now, because now it's possible to farm it. And they served me lunch that had this stuff in just about every food you could imagine. And their ice cream and their noodles, and I think they served beer with it, blue-green colored beer. And it wasn't quite as good as advertised, but it was okay. And I understand it had a lot of healthy food in it. So this is actually an example. There are a few others too. Chlorella, which grows in ponds of green color, and it's now being grown commercially to some extent. It's grown especially in Southeast Asia as a energy-rich food, as a nutraceutical or a agent that invigorates health. And so you can buy that in food stores in the US also, and a lot of people swear by it. Some new ones that have come along. This is a little alga these are all microscope pictures, of course, that looks like this. It's a little swimming thing that when you treat it badly, make it unhappy, it changes to this color, and it produces beta-carotene, which is a molecule many of you have heard of. Beta-carotene is an orange-colored pigment that occurs also in plants, and it's grown in very large quantities right next to the oceans because you let the ocean water evaporate and it gets very high salt, and these guys like high salt, and you feed it to chickens and it makes the egg yolks yellow instead of white. And it's used commercially for various things like that. And also, microalgae are used now commercially in the aquaculture business. Various kinds of aquaculture use microalgae. Here's one other example I'll give you before we move on. Just in the last 6 or 7 years, there's a little guy that's a green-colored guy that turns a bright red when you take it under extreme conditions like too high a light, not enough nitrogen. And it can be grown now. Just in the last 5 years, people have learned how to grow it such that they can extract this product here, sell it for about $10,000 a kilogram. So it's a pretty profitable business. you take a pinch of that and put it in your commercial source of lobster, and it changes it from gray to red. People in the US want red lobster, they don't want gray lobster. And so this is a practical application already. So all of these things are meant to point out that algae are important already in the world and are becoming more and more important, leaving fuels aside. Well, I think you all know now why we're talking about fuels today. We all know that fossil fuels are in limited supply, even though today I heard a report from the BBC that there's a lot more than people had anticipated. But of course, they are CO2 emitters. They produce lots of other noxious gases. They're getting more and more expensive to extract. And so there's lots of reasons now where we're looking for alternatives to fossil fuels. Now, I've got 2 or 3 kind of complicated slides here. Not real complicated, I hope. But the intention here is to just illustrate why we want to get rid of fossil fuels and why biofuels are probably the only real answer we have today. Fossil fuels are useful because of these reasons. They're transportable, storable. They're actually cheap, even though when you fill up your gas tank, it doesn't seem that way. When you can buy a gallon of gasoline cheaper than you can buy a gallon of milk, that's really pretty cheap considering the relative difference in the energy content of those 2 gallons. So they're valuable, but non-renewable. We take them out of the ground. We might get them back in the ground in a few hundred million years, but most of us won't be around to enjoy that. They are net emitters of carbon dioxide, as you know. And also they emit a lot of other noxious gases that go into some of them are greenhouse gases. Some of them, the last time I was in China a couple of years ago, and this is tragic, you could look straight at the sun and all you'd see is a little dull glow on a full sunny day because of the smog in the cities, because of the problem of the gases. Same thing problem we had in places like Pittsburgh, Los Angeles, a few decades ago. And so this is because of the noxious gases that are emitted by fossil fuels. So there's a number of reasons why we want to substitute something else, even though fossil fuels can be used for all of these important things. They do are a net emitter of carbon dioxide. Fossil fuels going through the whole cycle, ultimately ending up with carbon dioxide from those energy-rich molecules. Well, there's a lot of kinds of alternatives. It's not just biofuels, as you all know. There's lots of other possibilities for alternatives. For example, and some of them use light. For example, solar cells are the really hot item that are becoming more and more affordable. Nuclear and wind are 2 others, and most of these are renewable. Nuclear, not necessarily, but these others certainly are. And all they do is they cycle electrons around, doing energy conversion, first of all, through electricity, light energy electricity, and then that can be utilized to heat buildings, drive industrial processes, and generally make life easier for all of us. But what about driving cars, driving airplanes, and things like that? Well, maybe someday we'll be able to drive cars just as we do with gasoline with electric motors, or with batteries. But no, there haven't been really very careful life cycle analysis of how much that costs. In other words, you've got to build the batteries. You've got to charge them up. And where do you get the energy to do that? And so it takes an awful lot of energy from these solar cells to do all of these things. And maybe we can do fuel cells, such as hydrogen cells. Maybe we can make storage batteries that will work. But we're a long ways away from that being a mature technology. So these other things don't really substitute for petroleum as transportation fuels. Well, carbon-based biomass can do that. And the logic is pretty clear. Light on photosynthetic organisms makes energy-rich molecules, just like the ones in the ground. These carbon-containing molecules then can be transported easily. They can be stored, just like fossil fuels can. And ultimately, they can do the same kinds of things that we can get from electricity sources, but they can also be used as fossil fuels. And so both plants and algae turn out to be very practical from that sense that they can be stored, they can be transported, they're energy rich, and so they're good substitutes for fossil fuels. But plants, it turns out, have a lot of problems that algae don't have. And I've summarized them here. I'm not going to bother to read this, and I don't know if we want to take time to ask you to read it, so I'll just summarize them very quickly, a few of them. For example, plants almost invariably, if you want to grow enough of them to actually make a dent in the fuel requirements of this country, you're going to have to either use agricultural land or environmentally sensitive land, huge amounts of it. And of course, you run into all kinds of problems when you do that. Food costs go up, you destroy irreplaceable environment and so forth. Plants also require rather specialized food. Their food has to be supplied, and their fertilizer, I should say, has to be supplied in rather special ways. Algae are much less particular. You can grow them on wastewater from the flue gas that comes off of power plants. Some grow in salt water, some in fresh water. They're very, very versatile in where they can grow. And because of this diversity, and also because of the fact that they grow so much faster than other kinds of plants, they're considered now by most people to be the only viable, probably the only viable long-term source of alternative fuels, or biofuels anyway, to fossil fuels. And so that's why we're talking about algae today, because they really have this, this unique ability to grow fast, to use so many kinds of resources, nutrients, under conditions that plants and most other organisms can't grow, and produce many different kinds of products that are useful. All right, so what about those products that you can get from algae? What kind of products can you actually get from this algae? Well, here's kind of the logic of what you do. You first of all got to find the right strains, of course, the right kinds of algae, and I won't say much about that. But you first of all have got to cultivate it, got to harvest it, you've got to extract something from it, and process it. So these are kind of logical steps. Actually, this is true of plants or any other biomass. With algae, you can intercept at any one of these steps and get something useful here, here, or here. And so just to illustrate this, this is kind of what's being done these days. All of these things are being developed as we speak. None of these are mature industries yet, but all of these are processes that are right now being developed by major oil companies, by some other private companies, and so forth. One is you just harvest and concentrate the algae. You don't do any of this downstream kind of stuff. You just harvest it as a biomass. It's a slime that you concentrate into a slime, and then you process it in some way. These are the names of the couple of the prominent ones that are being used, pyrolysis, gasification, and ultimately you can get just about any product you want. The Exxon, BP, all these people know how to process just about any organic molecule into any other. So you can get gasoline, jet fuel, biodiesel, any of these things. So primarily gasoline and jet fuel are the ones that are being examined from this process. Or you can go on to the next step here, extract the desired product, and have what we call a drop-in fuel, something that product you just extract from the algae, and you can make ethanol, you can make a hydrocarbon that can build into many kinds of different kinds of fuels, and this is being done today also. In fact, there's some engineering been done, genetic engineering that's been done, that certain kinds of algae actually not only will make the product you want, but it actually excretes it from the cell. Now, this is really exciting because you don't have all the complications of harvesting algae and so forth. Hasn't been proven at large scale, but it just gives you an idea of where we're heading and where we are right now. Or we can move on down the scale here and process or refine a product. One of the products that's refined is a lot of algae fill up with fats. They fill up with something called triglycerides, or neutral oils, they're sometimes called. They actually have, some of them have more than 50% of their body weight in these bubbles inside, these little droplets of these oils. And these can be processed very easily into biodiesel. I would have preferred to have said biodiesel here because that's primarily what they're used for, but other kinds of biofuels as well. So this gives you some idea of some of the possibilities that are already being exploited today. Well, if you read some of the literature that you can find on the web or in some trade organizations, you'd think the problems were all solved. And a lot of problems are solved. So let's just look at what some of the current status is, what has been solved, for example. We know algae that grow very fast already. There are algae that double every 4 or 5 hours in the light. And that means you get the amount of biomass that you had at the beginning of the day, you'll have 8 times as much or 16 times as much at the end of the day. That's pretty fast. You don't find any plant that doubles once in a day. It's twice as big at the end of the day as it is at the beginning. So it's just remarkable how fast some of them grow. And some of them are really fat. They produce lots of oil or other valuable products. Of course, it's a trick getting both in the same alga, and that's something I won't talk much about today, but that's part of the art of trying to get a valuable product produced fast enough that you can that it's practical to grow and harvest as a fuel. But at least you can do each one of these things. These are just some examples. This one grows very fast. This one I showed you before, is one that's just loaded with lots and lots of oil. We know a lot about ways to grow algae, even at fairly large scale. For example, these are pictures I actually borrowed from different sources from the web. These are different types of ways that people grow algae in closed systems, they're called closed bioreactors, or in more open system, like this thing here called a raceway, or in open ponds like this, where these reddish colored one is used to grow beta carotene. So these things already exist today. There are a lot of patents on these kinds and other kinds of growing facilities. We also have a lot of tools for extracting materials from algae, such as this right here. This is a commercial thing that can take algae, concentrate it, actually take the product, and you end up with a product that is an oil. And we have something, this doesn't happen to be one from the University of Texas, but I'm going to tell you a little bit later about something very similar to this that actually is being done right now and produced right now at the University of Texas. Another thing that's interesting is that in order to commercialize farm animals and crops, it was necessary to genetically modify them. And genetic modification of algae is way behind genetic modification of almost all other kinds of organisms. But certain bacteria-like ones can be genetically modified very easily right now. Those that are called cyanobacteria can be modified quite easily right now. The ones that are most promising for most kinds of commercial products, such as biofuels, are still very, very difficult to get DNA in and out of as we want to make them produce just the right amount of just the right products. That's something that is very intensely being researched in many universities, including our own, and something that I think is going to make a huge change if we can have something that grows fast but doesn't produce just exactly the product we want, so we tweak it so it produces that product, and it produces in a way that the alga doesn't stick to the sides or have other problems. You can see how we can do just like people did with wheat over the last 10,000 years, where it doesn't fall over every time the wind blows, it doesn't get killed by roundworms and all sorts of things like that. Those are problems that still need to be solved, and probably genetic engineering will be very important for the future, and in fact is already starting to play a role in getting appropriate algae for commercial exploitation. Now, here's another one of those things in the bottom, I'm sorry. Here's where we are right now, I think. I think we're at a very exciting time right now, and there are a few companies worldwide now that are making a huge step. Many companies have been growing things at pilot plant scale. They've been growing algae in ponds half as big as this room, let's say, or maybe as big as this room, or in closed bioreactors that would take up about the amount of this room. And if they have a problem, they can afford to start over. They can rinse it out, they can bleach it if they need to, and start over. But when you start talking about 100 acres, and then we're talking about a different story. You can't afford to bleach it out every week or every month. And so when you scale up to large scale, the kind of scale that's required, let's say, to make any meaningful dent at all in petroleum products that are being produced today. In other words, something like hundreds of barrels per day, or thousands of barrels at least per year. Then we're talking about having to scale up. And several companies have made a commitment now that in 2012 or 2013, they will be scaled up to a scale where they actually can begin producing a continuous product, not just fly an airplane once and then that's it with something they've concentrated over time, but actually scale up so they can continually produce it. And I'll just mention one, because we have a representative here and he can fight with me if he disagrees. This is one of the larger and I think better companies in actually exploiting algae commercially, and their goal is to make biofuels. And so next year they're committed to 100 acres and perhaps 400 acres within the next few years. That's big enough that probably it'll be continued to be, if that works, then we probably can scale on up to hundreds of acres or square miles, which is needed, of course, for biofuel. So it's a very exciting thing. We all have to hope that this succeeds, that they can solve problems that they are working on right now of avoiding the co-culture crashing frequently. Well, all these things are positive, and I've sort of mentioned a few of the caveats along the way. But with all these positive things now, being able to grow the algae, we're starting to know how to genetically engineer them. We have the bioreactors and things available. There's certainly a market for all the products. So why aren't we filling our gas tanks right now with algae oil or algae-based gasoline? So that's what I want to talk about just a little bit here. And I know when in telling you this that there are going to be people that may disagree with me. I'm talking to hundreds of companies, not hundreds maybe, but at least dozens of companies over the last 5 years who are attempting to commercialize algae. I think I can say with significant confidence that right here is where the main limitation is. These things still have work to do. But I can assure you some of the clever people, including those here at the University of Texas, are figuring out ways to extract desirable products, process them. But trying to cultivate those algae in large scale is non-trivial and continues to be a challenge. And here's the problem. No one ever in the history of man has ever taken a microorganism and grown it at huge scale. We've done that with wheat. We've done that with cattle. We can grow thousands, how many cattle we want. We can do that with just about every large kind of organism, but no one's ever done that with any microorganism before. We don't know how to do it. There are some models. For example, cheese manufacture uses processing material, bacteria, to process and make the cheese. But this is done inside. This is done in stainless steel vats, very clean. They start over again. They clean everything out, sterilize, and start over again. The same with alcoholic beverages, the beer industry, the wine industry, which use yeast, of course, as part of the processing. They do that in very expensive containers. So, and pharmaceuticals use bacteria, but they pay $2 or $3 million just to build one vat to grow these in. You can't sell a product for a few dollars a gallon when you do that. You've got to sell it for a few tens of thousands of dollars a pound if you're going to make money on that. Well, and we can't use existing farming techniques. We can't use, this is macroalgae, the big kinds that I mentioned earlier that are used to make this $100 million industry of carrageenan and these other products. We can't use commercial land methods because these algae have to be grown in water. There's very few kinds of algae that actually can be grown. In fact, all algae have to have water around them before they will actually grow fast. So these techniques don't work. What we have to do, have to develop, and are developing now, is a combination of two different kinds of industries. The industrial microbiology and molecular biology and the molecular biology processes that are now used in very expensive processes have many things to teach us about growing large-scale microalgae. And then aquaculture of big algae has some other principles that we can marry together along with some new technologies, I think, ultimately to mass culture microalgae. But these have not been properly married yet. A lot of people are working on it, but these problems of growing huge quantities, and by the way, this is a cartoon picture, it's not something that actually exists today, but before we can get to this point, I think we're going to have to utilize new technologies as well as some combination of things that have already been learned in these successful endeavors here. So why is it so darned hard to grow algae at large scale? Now, what I learned when I took some engineering courses back at Purdue University is that you learn how to do something well and you scale up, you have economy of scale. Things get cheaper, you can do things in assembly lines, various kinds of ways to do things cheaper. But as, for example, petroleum engineers know, and some others, that scaling up some kinds of things leads to emergent problems, problems you couldn't have anticipated. You grow them at one scale and everything works fine. You multiply it by 10, make things 10 times as big. Things show up that you would have never guessed. And that's exactly what's been happening with growing algae, and that's where many of the problems are. The more one scales up, the more these emergent problems show up. And these are just some examples. No one in large scale, no matter how closed your system, can keep bacteria out, can keep fungi out, can keep other biological contaminants out. It costs the pharmaceutical industries that use bacteria this way millions and millions of dollars to keep those out, and then they still have to start over sometimes. It's not trivial, and any microbiologist in the room knows how difficult it is in even 10-gallon bioreactors to keep bacteria out without very expensive equipment. So you get competitor algae in there, and many of them will grow faster than what you want probably, because you want a specialized one that produces just the product you want. It's not likely to be the one that grows fastest. So you have problems with competitors. Some of them actually can be pretty nasty, like this little microcystis here. We also get predators, things that eat them. There's a number of kinds of predators, little animals and little fungus-like things that just gobble up algae. And so your supply of algae will look green one day, and the next day it'll look kind of gray. It's been eaten because these little predators that like algae get in and eat them up. Diseases such as bacteria and virus can remove the nutrients, can cause toxins to form in various ways, and the viruses, of course, can actually get inside and destroy the algae. So all of these things are problems that, in my view, have a lot of work yet to be solved. Companies that are scaling up now are taking a risk, and I really admire them for that. They're assuming that these will be solved by the time that they have large scale, or at least solved enough that they can continuously produce a product economically. I'm not sure that they are yet. This is where a lot of research is needed, just like a lot of experience and research was needed in farming practice. So we could large-scale crops, 300 bushel of the acre corn, and cows that produced unbelievable amount of milk. We need to do the same thing with algae. And then also abiotic factors, non-biological factors. What do you do when the temperature drops 20 degrees? You can't grow these inside. Well, most algae can tolerate a fairly broad range of temperature if you're careful about the kind you select. But they don't grow very well at certain temperatures. Once the temperature changes 20 degrees, they're pretty unhealthy compared to something else that might be invading. And so all of a sudden you shift everything and something else just takes over. So these are some of the problems that we really have to deal with. Well, before I get to this, I just want to say that progress is being made on all of these fronts. And I don't want to spend time talking about progress around the world, but what I would like to say a little bit about is some of the things that are happening here at the University of Texas. They're actually addressing these problems and beginning to solve some of them. I'm just going to go through a few slides, and just one slide each, just talk about what some of the groups here that are working on campus are actually doing to promote this field. For example, there's a lot of professors here that do mostly pure research that have not been directly involved with the biofuel. Most of these, some of them have been. I've been actively involved with some of this, and a few others have also. But all of these are excellent algal biologists. And the University of Texas, probably for the last 30 or 40 years, has a higher concentration of algal biologists than any other university in the United States. 3 of our former members were members of the National Academy of Sciences, and that's a very prestigious organization in the U.S., as many of you know. And so we still have some excellent algal biologists here on campus that are interested in various algal problems, all the way from molecular biology to ecology. We also have a number of groups on campus that are studying the potential of algae as a commodity for biofuels and for other high-value products. And so I want to just mention a few of those. And I have to apologize, I don't even know about all the groups on campus. There's groups that are doing things that I hear about indirectly and I don't have a chance to contact. So I apologize if there's anyone here who I haven't mentioned things that they're doing with respect to commercializing or learning how to commercialize algae. So let's just talk about a few. This is probably the one that has made the most progress so far, certainly the one that is the most visible so far. And this group is located primarily up in the north campus of the University of Texas, the Pickle Research Campus, which does an awful lot of applied research. And this particular group, called the Center for Electromechanics, has started maybe 5 years ago, actually attempting to grow algae, attempting to process it using some of the skills that they'd learned in other technologies that they've worked on over the last few decades. And so now they have made an effort at growing, harvesting, lysing, and extracting algae all the way through. I would say growing has been a challenge for them, like it has everybody else, so they're relying on others to grow the algae for them. But certainly in terms of harvesting, breaking them open is what lysing means, and then extracting products, they've done surprisingly well, I think. And also they have a way to a little portable machine that does all of these processes in something they can drive to some place where the algae is being grown and just go through these processes. A company that's helping them do that is called Open Algae, associated closely with them, and this is a portable device that Open Algae, this company, actually, I guess the Center for Electromechanics actually is a part of this company, actually has found the resources for actually building this amazing portable device right here at the University of Texas. We have another company represented by several individuals here. Oops, I'm just jumping right along here too fast. Sorry about that. That has for several years also been developing algae technology. And what I admire about them is they've actually focused on trying to grow the algae. And they have built some, that doesn't show here very well, but some vertical tubes that are aligned very close together so they can have a very high density of algae. Once again, they're up in the Pickle Center in the North Campus. And they can harvest 5,000 gallons at a time. Now, that's small potatoes compared to what we need for a biofuel, but it's a significant pilot scale project. And so they can harvest these and they can provide them to the Center of Electromechanics, which is just a short distance away, or they can provide them anywhere else. And this is a modular unit that could be constructed at a reasonable price anywhere in the world. And so I think this is a technology, and there's others in the country too. I'm not saying this is the only one, but I think they have a very clever device that we're proud of here at the University of Texas, and we're hoping can be developed into something that can be expanded to make make biofuels and other valuable products. Let's see. And so I'll just, this is kind of a fascinating one. Dr. Malcolm Brown is a professor that's been here for many decades, and maybe not many decades, that sounds bad. That's how long I've been here. But for several decades. He and one of his graduate students, who happens to work in the culture collection where I am right now, a very genius guy, discovered how to take a little alga that takes nitrogen out of the atmosphere. It doesn't need any nitrogen fertilizer, grows fast, and makes sugar that it actually excretes into the medium. Now, there's still problems with harvesting it and other things that haven't been solved, but I think it's a remarkable example of both pure and applied research that it's obvious where the commercial market is being done for this. And so this is another lab. Here's another lab. This man here, who's one of our best teachers, also has a research program, quite a number of undergraduates and graduate students, and he spent several years studying the use of wastewater and other waste streams in order to grow algae. So you can grow them a lot cheaper using these waste streams. And I haven't saved much time to talk about what I do, but I think I should at least say a little bit about the things that go on in my lab and in my facilities. As David Laudy pointed out, we do have a very large collection of algae, and it gets an awful lot of attention these days. We've had visitors from just about, I think, every major oil company probably, and many, many others that have examined our resources. What we have is probably the largest, certainly the most diverse collection of algae in the world. All those different kinds that I've shown you pictures of before, we have all of those and many, many more. And we have no idea what the commercial potential of those is. Algae are more diverse genetically than any other group of organisms in the world. They're not genetically homogeneous. Like all animals have some homogeneity. Algae are much more different from each other than plants are different than animals, for example. And so the point there is that there's a tremendous number of biological molecules that are produced, that some very complicated ones that are hard to synthesize artificially. And we don't even know all the ones that are there. The research that's being done here at Texas and elsewhere is examining what some of those molecules are. So we're gradually learning what those molecules are, but we have a resource of organisms which have been identified, we know how to grow, and now we need to discover what some of those products are. And so we do lots of things in the culture collection, including new organisms that are discovered. We're one of the repositories that keeps newly discovered organisms. We provide algae to the biofuels business. We train. We have a training program every 2 months where people from all over the country, even all over the world, the last time half the attendees were from other countries, learn how to grow algae, learn basic principles of growing algae, so when they want to scale up, at least they know the basics of how to recognize contaminants, how to measure how fast they grow, and various ways of handling those algae. So that's some of the things that we do. Now, I've moved through awfully fast, but what I want to do now is talk a little bit about where I think we're going in the future. So these are things that we're doing right now, and we aren't there yet, but it looks pretty promising. So where are we going to be a few years from now or a few decades from now? Well, how about the short term? And I'll use, for short term, I'll just say the next 5 years. I could have said the next 2 years, but I'll stretch it out even further than that. And I would say at that meeting I was at 10 days ago, 80% of the people said, we're there. In 5 years, we're going to have algae as a commodity. It'll be traded just like wheat and corn, or oil, and lots of it will be available. At least half the people would say that, not all. I think there is considerable skepticism among basic scientists, and being a basic scientist myself, I fall into that category. I think in 5 years, there are too many problems to solve in terms of how we grow the algae. How do we keep enough control of the algae so it just doesn't blow up every 2 weeks and we have to start over again. So I see that as a major reason. Also, how do you harvest it? These little guys are not much bigger than bacteria. How do you filter them? You can't filter them very well. If you try to use some kind of a centrifuge, too expensive. There's just many problems with harvesting, and we still don't know how to do that cheaply enough. So growing them and harvesting them are two reasons why I think it's going to take more than 5 years before we really know how to do that. I give it a 30% chance, but maybe if I were being more honest, I'd say a 15% chance. Less than a 50% chance, I think. And what about in the intermediate term, the next 5 to 25 years? There's broad optimism. Almost everybody believes that's possible. And I actually give that an 80% chance. I don't give it an 80% chance that it'll be able to substitute for petroleum fuels, because I think they're going to extend out quite a long time, maybe longer than 25 years. But in terms of using algae as a commodity for maybe human food, not just food supplement, but for food basics, for animal feed, fish feed, and so forth, other things that are required in large amounts, I think there's a very good chance. I give it an 80% chance within the next 25 years, maybe within 5 years, that we'll be able to do that. What about the long term? Let's say after 2035. It's hard to imagine that far in advance, but I would say there's nearly universal optimism, and this is what will probably surprise some people from what I've already said. I give it a 10% chance. Why do I think that algae are going to be so popular for a while, and we ought to encourage this field because it's going to be needed for decades? Why do I think it probably has only a 10% chance way out in the future? Well, here's my view on this, and this is just my view. We know about solar collectors, and we know that they aren't going to be able to substitute for petroleum and transportation fuels, at least in the foreseeable future. Maybe we can get fuel cells to work better. Maybe we can get electric cars and other electric things. I can't imagine an electric battery being light enough that you can put it on an airplane reasonably. But here's what I think is going to happen. And a lot of research is being done on that already, is that we're going to have something called artificial photosynthesis. Now, artificial photosynthesis is not fuel cells. What artificial photosynthesis would do, and this is kind of a holy grail for photosynthesis, what it would do, it would take a solar collector and use that electricity, and what that electricity would do is actually chemically combine carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and source of water into oxygen, and something that you probably can't see from where some of you are sitting, what I got written right down here, is energy-rich organic molecules. That's exactly what natural photosynthesis does. It uses light energy to combine carbon dioxide and water in a way that it produces energy-rich molecules and oxygen. We aren't even close to knowing how to do it. It sounds like all the chemistry that we can do these days, it sounds like a trivial problem. The problem is that we don't know how to separate, well, it's kind of hard to describe without going into technical details, but in terms of what we call the primary photochemistry, to separate electrons and keep them apart long enough that they can actually undergo the kinds of reactions required to split water into hydrogen atoms and oxygen, and split carbon dioxide in a stable way that we can make these energy-rich molecules. There's no theoretical reason why we can't do it. There's not a lot of research being done in that area. Some universities are. I don't know if the University of Texas is doing anything specific in that area now, I hope they are, because in the long run, this is going to be, as far as I can tell, a real meaningful answer to biofuels. And of course, this is carbon dioxide, carbon neutral, because you can just constantly recycle that. You capture the carbon dioxide, you drive your car and you burn it off again, and this produces it again. So we don't have to worry about net carbon dioxide. We're doing artificial photosynthesis. So this is just kind of a summary of what I've said up to this point. So should we invest in algae technology? Well, I think what I've said should be, I hope I've made it clear that we need to invest in still some basic research, particularly in terms of large-scale culturing and harvesting. So we certainly ought to invest in that. I think that there should be some investment in some of the downstream processing. This is more applied things, and that's being done right now. Companies are doing that, and I'm glad to see that. But so I think it especially needs peer research, and that's been one of the real problems so far with this whole field is, and what's happened so far is kind of the opposite of when a field generally develops. Normally what happens is, if we take electricity for example, one had to have Michael Faraday before you could have Michael Dell. You first had to understand some principles of how electricity worked, and then you had to learn how to apply it in various ways. And finally, you had an Edison, and then ultimately all the wonderful electronics that came today. We're almost doing it in the reverse order now. No one really tried particularly to understand the basic problems of growing algae at large scale. But companies started putting a lot of money into, and the government did also, a lot of money into growing algae commercially. The goal was, in so many years, make sure that we can grow the algae commercially. And so that became a focus without necessarily recognizing what some of these fundamental problems were. And so many of these companies now are backing off and saying, now we got to do some applied research. We got to understand some of the principles in order to make this technology work. And a few of these companies now have backed off a step further and saying there's still some basic research, and they're doing that basic research now. But it's kind of an expensive way to do it because these companies are working as a vertical team, not communicating with other vertical teams that are doing the same thing. What we needed, really, in my opinion, starting off, was to have horizontal teams, maybe sponsored by the National Science Foundation and other peer research groups, to understand these basic problems of scaling up algae, and then done the applied research, and then allowed the investment to come in to actually exploit that commercially. So I think that's what a problem we've had. I think we're catching up very fast right now because these companies that started out with the technology are now doing peer research and applied research, and I learned from the last meeting they're sharing some of the information, which is nice, and so others can do these things in parallel, and so I think we've come a long ways, but I still think we have many hurdles to overcome. And I think with that, I'd like to stop, but I'd like to just tell you about something I have right here. I hope I've convinced you that algae isn't there yet, but that it's a very exciting horizon, I think, and there's every reason to believe that in a few years from now, some of the products, perhaps some of your medicines, perhaps foods, perhaps things that are fed to livestock and fish will come from algae. And one of my graduate students, Tanisha Hancock, are you here, Tanisha? Back there, is going to come up here, and anyone who would like, I got little samples of algae here, and these are a kind that came from a Max Planck Institute that closed a few years ago in Germany. Their whole research was built around this kind of algae. And these little guys were used to develop some of the molecular biology that's done. They anticipated something called RNA that communicates information within cells using algae. And these individual little tubes and things here are single cells. And if you can keep it alive, put it in the light, don't let it get too cold for a few months, these will grow in. Some of them will have little caps that look like little umbrellas and various things. And so I'm concluding my lecture now, but I'm going to leave these up here, and I've asked Tanisha if she'd come up and make sure that anyone who's interested, as long as they last, will pick one of these up and take them with you and set them in your window ledge so they get some light, and maybe you'll actually see it before it dies off, which it will do in a few months under these little tubes. You may actually see it blossom into something different. And they're harmless. I wouldn't drink the water, it's salt water, but These are harmless little guys, so you don't have to worry about that. Just don't pop the lid and spill the liquid out. But you're welcome to take one. It gives the name of the organism and uses the word UTEX, which is the name of the organization, our organized research unit that I'm responsible for. And so I think that concludes my talk, and I thank you so much for listening.